Professor Higuchi came here in 1967, and he was really recruited primarily by the late Professor Smithman, who had arrived on this campus in, I believe, 1962. They knew each other because they had both been faculty members at the University of Wisconsin together, and Tack was the first one to come here, built the medicinal chemistry department into a nationally and internationally recognized program, and then he recruited his friend, the late Takeru Higuchi, to the University of Kansas. But in addition to Ed Smithman's role in recruiting Tack, there were other things that really attracted Tack here, and one of those was the opportunity to be involved in entrepreneurial activities. And so Tack came here in '67, and shortly thereafter was involved in the formation of a company by the name of Alza Corporation, which was located here on the West Campus for a number of years, and eventually moved to the Bay Area, where it became a very successful company and was bought a few years ago by Johnson & Johnson. But Tack loved to play in both the academic arena and the industrial arena, and coming here to KU really allowed him to pursue both. And in fact, he was a Regents professor here at the university, and the Regents professorship really was set up with the intention of allowing people like Tack to pursue entrepreneurial activities. So actually KU was involved, if you want, in biotechnology or entrepreneurial activities back in the late '60s, before many universities really got involved in it more in the '80s and the '90s. And, you know, there are individuals like Professor Higuchi who have the skill to really straddle the fence between being a good teacher and a good scholar and a good mentor, and also being creative in the sense of discovering new drug delivery technologies or new drugs. And it takes a special individual to be able to do both those things. And Tack was that kind of person. He had that ability to think as a scholar and be able to train graduate students, but he also had the ability to think in a very practical way about developing and inventing new delivery devices, new drugs, and some of which actually have appeared in the marketplace. I did my undergraduate degree in pharmacy at the University of Wisconsin in the '60s, and by the time I became a pharmacy student, Professor Smithman had left Wisconsin and come to Kansas. So I never had the opportunity to meet him during my tenure at Wisconsin, but I often heard his name mentioned by faculty there at Wisconsin as an excellent medicinal chemist and an excellent mentor. Professor Higuchi at the time, when I was an undergraduate student, was there at Wisconsin, and I would frequently see him or interact with his students. But when I decided to go to graduate school and do my PhD work, many of the Wisconsin faculty suggested that I should think about Kansas and think about Ed Smithman as a mentor. And having been born and raised in Wisconsin, Kansas was a long ways away for both me and my wife, but we came here, I remember, in December of 1966 to interview, and we instantly were attracted to Ed Smithman and his late wife, Claire Smithman, because of the way they dealt with people, the way they interacted with people. We moved here in June of 1967 to I pursued my PhD degree here at KU. And we had such a wonderful experience at KU, the 2 years we were here, that after I completed my postdoctoral stint at the NIH in 1971, I had several academic offers, and one of them was to return to the University of Kansas in the biochemistry department. And I immediately seized on that opportunity, and we moved back here. And so for the next 12 years or so, I was a faculty member in the in the Department of Biochemistry, where I rose up through the ranks and became a distinguished professor in the late 1970s. And then in 1983, I made the move into the Department of Pharmaceutical Chemistry and became chairman of the department, replacing Professor Iguchi when he retired. The transition that took place in about 1983-84 time frame was, for me, as an individual and as a scientist, perhaps a very bold move, and one that I look back on as a very wise decision on my part. But I was a faculty member in biochemistry and actually doing quite well in terms of both as a researcher and a teacher. But the opportunity came up when the late Professor Iguchi announced his retirement, that people expressed the idea that I might become chairman of this department. Now, the reason it was such a bold move is that biochemistry is very different than pharmaceutical chemistry. And to the layperson, that may be difficult to understand because they're both chemistry, but they're very, very different. And so when I became chairman of this department, I had to essentially recreate myself as a scientist and as a teacher, and train people who ultimately would do very, very different types of research than what I was doing, what they would have done if they were biochemistry students. So for a period of 2 or 3 years, from 83 to 85 and 86, I kind of recreated myself, but it was very, very healthy and very stimulating because I entered a field that had focused for decades on the hardcore chemistry aspects of drugs and drug development. And I guess I brought to the field a different vision, which was more biologically oriented. And as a result, we were able to create here a program in biotechnology, which was unique in the 80s, and we were able to create new technology that had a biological orientation that now is very, very widely used worldwide in the pharmaceutical industry. So I often say I came into the field with no blinders on, and I could look at the field and I could envision doing things that other people hadn't thought about. And I guess I've always been a risk taker and somewhat bold and willing to take chances, and I did, and I look back on it as a very smart move on my part, and one that has brought me great joy, because I think I can say I've accomplished things in biochemistry and I've accomplished things in pharmaceutical chemistry, two very, very different fields. Right. I mean, I think that there was resistance in several different ways. One was, it was a risk for me to take this, for me to take this risk, because I had established myself in the field of biochemistry and medicinal chemistry, and I was recognized by my colleagues in that area. And most people would say, well, why would you move? Because you've already established yourself. But yet, I must be honest and say that, being about 40 years old, maybe I was suffering from midlife crisis. I really wanted to pursue some new things. I wanted to do some new things, and this gave me the opportunity to do that. And one of the wonderful, wonderful things about KU is that KU was willing to take a chance and to take somebody from a very different discipline and allow them to become chairman of the department. And I was given the resources from the central administration of the university, and was able to work with the Endowment Association to garner resources that really allowed me as chairman and allowed the faculty in the department to do things that most other institutions I could not have done, because the resources were available. And for example, by working with the Endowment Association, we were able to secure resources that allowed us to retain some of our best faculty through distinguished professorships, and it allowed us to recruit the very best graduate students we could into our program, and it allowed us to partly fund the Dolph Simons research laboratories, which we're sitting in right now. So at the end of the day, an academic program, an excellent academic program, has excellent faculty, excellent students, and excellent facilities. And really both the KU Central Administration and the Endowment Association has played an extremely important role in our ability to really build this program into one of the very best in the world. As a child growing up in Wisconsin, I come from a background that my parents were common laborers. Neither had more than a grade school education, but they both were very interested in seeing my sister and I get good education. So they were always very supportive of us getting a good education. But to be honest with you, until I went away to college, I probably focused most of my time and energy on basketball and baseball. And it wasn't until I went to the University of Wisconsin where I became a more serious scholar. And I think what probably changed my attitude towards learning and changed my focus in life was the fact that when I was at Wisconsin as a pharmacy student, my parents provided me with some support, but they just didn't have the resources to pay for my college education. And so I had to get a job. And instead of working at a restaurant or other things of that sort, I got a job in a research lab. And I was given the opportunity to do all the dirty jobs that no one else wanted to do in the laboratory, like wash dishes and things of that sort. But I was surrounded by these individuals who were graduate students and postdocs, and I guess I became very interested in the world of doing research, and I got very excited by it. And over a 3-year period, I progressed from being the person who did all the dirty jobs in the lab to the person who was able to have a research project. And as a result, I guess I became addicted to it. And I became addicted to discovering new things and exploring new things. And so one of the things that I've tried to do here at KU as a mentor from the day I arrived was to give undergraduate students the opportunity to work in a research lab, because the experience that I had at Wisconsin just totally changed my life. If I hadn't had that experience, I probably would have gone back north from Madison and practiced pharmacy. I probably would have had, a happy, productive life. But it was such a life-changing experience that I've tried here at KU in various different ways to give undergraduate students here at KU and across the country, actually, the opportunity to experience research. And some people like it and some people don't. It's a very frustrating, so at times it's a very frustrating experience, because most of the time things don't work. But when they do work and you discover something new, it's a very exciting, stimulating type of activity, and a very rewarding type of activity. In a university like this, as a professor, in a research-intensive university like KU, really faculty teach in a variety of different forms. For example, we traditionally think of the classroom setting and the undergraduate students, or in the case of pharmacy, the professional pharmacy students. And the traditional way of teaching is the presentation of a lecture and teaching in that form. And certainly I've been involved with doing that over the years. I taught both undergraduate classes and graduate classes in the biochemistry department. When I came into the pharmacy school, I teach both professional pharmacy students as well as graduate students in that kind of form. But the other type of teaching, which often isn't seen by even students, undergraduate students here at KU, or in particular lay people on the outside, is the training of graduate students in the discipline like pharmaceutical chemistry. This is a very one-on-one type teaching. And so over the years, I've had in my research group, and I often refer to it as my academic family, about 170 PhD students, master students, what are called postdoctoral fellows, and what are called visiting scientists. And these are individuals who work as my collaborators in the research lab. They will be here anywhere from, say, 2 years up to 5 years. And so you build a relationship with those individuals, which is not much different than you often have with your parents. And so like I look back on Ed Smithman as really my second father. And I would hope that many of my graduate students that I've had, or postdocs or visiting scientists, would look at me in a similar way, because it's a period of time when you're trying to learn from your advisor not only how to do science, but also how to identify important problems to work on, how to present your experimental results in a written format and in a verbal format, and how to behave in a society consisting of other scientists. And so, for example, I just gave a lecture, a discussion with graduate students recently on scientific ethics. And so even ethics is an extremely important part of the teaching. So I think when you look again at a university, a research-intensive university, teaching can be defined in lots of different ways. And I think while I pride myself on being a good classroom teacher, I also pride myself on being a good advisor, research advisor, and hopefully a good mentor. I guess at the end of the day, you'd have to ask my students and postdocs and fellows whether I was or was not a good mentor, but I hope I am. And as I have often said to people, I hope on my tombstone it says I was a good husband, a good father, a good teacher, and a good mentor. And I will be very happy if that's what's on my tombstone. Not that I would know any different, but when you get to be 60, 61, which I recently turned, you begin to look back on your life and you begin to say, what are the most important things in your life? And for me, the most important things have been, I have a wonderful wife who has tolerated my obsessive-compulsive behavior with respect to my role as a faculty member at the University of Kansas. And she has tolerated this now for, it'll be 40 years this coming June. I'm also, very proud of the 3 children that we have. They are all KU graduates and all off gainfully employed in very good jobs and very responsible, respectable individuals. And then, the third thing that I really think is important is those 170 students and postdocs and visiting scientists that I've worked with over the years. And many of these have gone into the pharmaceutical industry in the U.S., in Europe, in Japan. They have contributed significantly, I think, to discovering new drugs or new drug delivery systems, and each of their careers are flourishing. But I also have produced a fairly significant number of individuals who've chosen academic careers. So if you like, they might be clones of me in the sense that I now often run into young people who tell me that they just got their degree from Professor X at Y University, and I will tell them, well, that means you're my grandson or my granddaughter, because Professor X was actually one of my former students. So it's very nice to see individuals rise up through the ranks. I have some that are now distinguished professors at universities, some that are full professors, others that are chairman. I have a dean, the dean here at the School of Pharmacy, who's my boss's boss, Professor Ken Audis, or Dean Ken Audis, was a postdoctoral fellow of mine in the mid-1980s. So it's very nice to see these individuals go off and have successful careers. My wife and I have two wonderful grandchildren, Nicholas and Noel. They live in Boston, and they are, in my eyes, very, very special because, unfortunately, when early in my career, like most young professionals, I perhaps spent too much of my time in my office at the university and in my lab at the university, and perhaps not enough time mentoring my own children. Now it turns out my wife did a wonderful job, and the children are great, and so she should be given the credit for that. But now we have grandchildren, and I try very hard to spend time with them. They live in Boston. It makes it a little difficult, but we do travel to Boston quite frequently, and they do travel here. We have one very special grandchild in Noel, who's 8 years old. Noel is a Down syndrome child, and she's just the most wonderful little young lady who is very, very special. But Nicholas, our youngest grandchild, 5, is a very interesting young man, very bright young man, very pleasant to be around, and just great grandchildren. So I hope over the next few years I'll be able to find more time to spend with them than we have in the past. In the mid-1990s, when I was still chairman of this department, I often would get the faculty together on an annual basis, actually, to do strategic planning. And this is kind of an unusual activity in most academic departments, in part because academics by nature are independent entrepreneurs, and they like to do their own thing. But in reality, it's extremely important for an academic unit, whether it be a department or a college or a school, to periodically get together and get everybody to agree on a strategic plan. Where do you want the department, or where do you want the school, or where do you want the university to be in 5 or 10 years? So we did a lot of strategic planning during my tenure as chairman from 83 to 98. But in the mid-90s, one of our strategic planning sessions, we began to discuss how the pharmaceutical industry was changing. And this was about the time there were a lot of mergers and acquisitions, and European companies were buying American companies. And I pointed out to my colleagues that, our graduate students that we're training today are likely to be asked at some time in their career to spend time in Europe, or spend time in Japan, or Australia, or China, and that most of our students really were not well prepared to be able to deal with the differences in culture. And many of them, particularly American students, were apprehensive about traveling overseas. They had never really had that experience before. So I suggested to the faculty in probably 1995 that we should do an experiment, in the sense of having a meeting in Lawrence where we invite the faculty and graduate students from 12 universities around the world. I think we picked out 8 in Europe, and 3 in Japan, and 1 in Australia. And we would give our graduate students funding to actually set up a 2-day meeting that would be held here in Lawrence. And that was done in 1996, and it was a huge success. Our graduate students were able to interact one-on-one with European graduate students, with Japanese, with Australians. They were able to not only talk science, but they were able to compare the educational programs. They were able to to compare the differences in the societies across the world. And so we went from doing an experiment to actually setting up a not-for-profit organization in the state of Kansas called the Globalization of Pharmaceutics Education Network, which is called GPEN, now called GPEN. And what we decided to do was that we would have this type of meeting somewhere in the world every 2 years. So in '98 we went to the ETH in Zurich, Switzerland. They hosted the meeting. In 2000 we went to Uppsala, Sweden, where they hosted the meeting. In 2002 we were in University of Michigan, and then in 2004 we were in Kyoto, Japan. And the organization has now grown to from about 12 universities up to about 40 universities. The meeting in Kyoto had about 225 participants. Probably 150 of those, 175 of those were graduate students from all over the world. And we took from KU, I believe it was 12 or 14 graduate students to Japan. And again, here's where the university and the Endowment Association has been very, very helpful, because we were able to work with the Endowment Association to raise funding that we could then use to send these graduate students to Japan and to have this experience of attending a scientific meeting in Kyoto, Japan, interacting with Japanese, interacting with students from Singapore, from China, from Australia, from many, many European countries. And I think this program is going to have a dramatic effect on not only our own graduate students, but on graduate students in other universities all over the world. So it's very gratifying to see this experiment, what I conceived of as an experiment in 1995, actually be as successful as it has been. And I hope that these students, and I'm certain many of these students have benefited from this, and that it'll end up making them much better citizens of the world, not citizens of the United States or citizens of France or Germany or China or Japan. So and citizens not only in the sense of individuals, but also as scientists, because the industry now is highly globalized. And just to illustrate that, I was in Japan this spring and talking to Japanese scientists who on a daily basis interact in conference calls with people in England, in the East Coast, on the West Coast, and they have to be able to understand and respect each other and the differences in cultures, and the differences are very significant. And so I think this program will have an impact. Now, will I ever know for sure what the impact is? No, but I know enough people, and I know that I met enough people and talked to enough people that I know it's having a positive impact. So that is extremely rewarding. GPEN is an organization that was started here at KU in 1995 with the purpose of exposing graduate students in the pharmaceutical sciences to the world. And the major driver behind the formation of this organization was the dramatic paradigm shift that was going on in drug discovery and development around the world, where it had become globalized. So I really felt we needed to globalize the education of these students. And we did that by setting up this organization, holding meetings every 2 years that have been around the world in places like Zurich, in Uppsala, Sweden, University of Michigan, and Japan. And we will bring it back here in 2006 to KU for the 10th anniversary. And our graduate students are actively involved in the planning of that meeting right now. It's their meeting. My purpose in this organization is to provide them with a strategic vision, probably, and to raise money to allow them to do what they think is important to do. So, yeah, I think that my moving into the Department of Pharmaceutical Chemistry in 1983, and being the chairman of this department during the next 15 years, we really were involved in implementing change in our discipline. I think there are people all over the world that would look at KU and pharmaceutical chemistry and say, that was the department or that was the program that really led this discipline into the area of pharmaceutical biotechnology. Or this was the department or the group that led the discipline into the area of using cell culture techniques to study drug absorption and drug disposition. And let me elaborate on both of these. One has direct implications in terms of medicines that are used today by patients, and that is the area of pharmaceutical biotechnology. When I came into the department in the mid-'80s, the focus of this department, the focus of the discipline in general, was on small molecules, the traditional drugs that were being made and used by the patient population. But at this time, there was a revolution going on in biology, and this was the revolution referred to as molecular biology, and eventually emerged into what's called genomics and understanding the sequence of the genome, and then now proteomics. But what this revolution in biology led to was the identification of proteins. These are big molecules, very large molecules, that could be used as drugs. I mean, we've had some of these for decades, like insulin's been around for decades. But now we see many of the proteins that were worked on in the 80s that are being used therapeutically. Now, the revolution that I think we helped lead was that we identified in the 80s the need to train people who could go into the biotechnology companies and be able to take these proteins and develop them into dosage forms that could be used in a clinical setting, hospital or outpatient type setting. And so we decided in the mid-'80s that we needed to change the way we trained our graduate students. And this was a real paradigm shift, and a lot of people looked at us and said, whoa, this, what you're doing here is very risky. But it turns out we were the leaders in this area, and now many other universities have followed us and developed similar programs. So I think we were able to train people who went into the biotechnology industry, the companies that are common names now like Genentech and Amgen and Biogen, and we trained people who could go develop formulations of those proteins. So that training program has received a lot of recognition over the years, and again, it's one of those things that we took a risk, and it was the right move to make at the time. The other thing that I think we really have contributed to is that when, again, I came into the department, I came from more of a biology background, and there was very little biology that was being done, particularly cellular and molecular biology that was being done in this discipline. And we came up with the harebrained idea that we could actually figure out how to study the absorption of drugs after a drug is taken orally. Absorption means how does it get in the bloodstream. We could study that, not using humans or not using animals, but we could develop simple cell culture systems that would mimic the barriers that prevent drug absorption. And so we came up with the idea of growing cells onto small filters and then being able to study how they were transported across those cell monolayers. And we published some of this work in 1989 on a cell line called a CACO2 cell line. And I remember there were many skeptics about the value of this kind of experimental system. And it turns out during the next 4 or 5 years into the early 90s, people began to work with this system. Many people came here to KU to learn how to grow these cells. We had people come from Europe. We had people come from Japan to learn the technology. And today you would be hard-pressed to find a pharmaceutical company or a biotechnology company anywhere in the world that was not using these KECO2 cells as an integral part of drug discovery. And fortunately, you know, KECO2 cells are kind of affiliated or related back to me, which relates back to KU, which speaks to the quality and the innovation that goes on at KU. And it really doesn't, it's associated with me, and you know, it's unfortunate because it should be associated with all the graduate students and postdocs and visiting scientists that I had, because they're the ones that really did the work in the laboratory. I'm probably more the strategist and the person who has the ability to maybe identify what's really important and to take chances and to do those, to suggest those critical experiments. And so I think we've contributed in those two areas, which really has helped make a name for the University of Kansas. So hopefully, you know, many people in the world associate the University of Kansas with great basketball as well as great pharmaceutical sciences. No, I never have been a chess player. I actually made the mistake when I was a freshman in college of learning how to play bridge, and it almost ended up causing me to flunk out of college because I got addicted with bridge, but I gave that up quickly. But I think, I don't know where it comes from, but I've always had the ability to kind of look at what might be very complex things and boil them down to very simple things. And also the ability to be a strategist and take a bit from here and a bit from there and be able to combine all this together and come up with a plan, if you want. I tend to be a very organized person, and a person who often has been accused by my wife often accuses me of having lists of lists, but that's probably part of just the way I think about things and how I often have a plan. I have a plan usually for everything, but and I don't know where that really came from. I don't really know, because if I look back at my parents, I'm not sure that I can say either one of them were necessarily that way. But it's a characteristic which you know, I think has been a large part, contributed in a large part to my success.
How you're wired.
I think it's just how you're wired, yeah. I mean, maybe it's because I'm a pretty down-to-earth, very practical person who I often tell people that I'm extremely good at multitasking, but I'm also extremely good at completing every task that I take on. And again, I don't know where that comes from, but I know a lot of people who multitask, but often don't, you know, complete the tasks. But I'm very good at multitasking and completing tasks. You know, I often make the analogy that, again, probably being somewhat of a biologist, is that I'm very good at going for the jugular vein. You know, I really am good at being able to look at a big picture and sort out what's really important. Now, part of that, I think, is that you have to be a good listener. I think I meet so many people who aren't good listeners, and maybe they don't want to hear what I have to say, but I don't think they're good listeners. And I pride myself on listening very carefully to what people say, and also not only what they verbalize, but also their body language. And then, you know, from that, I then hopefully can derive what they're really trying to tell me. And yeah, as a faculty member, when you're working with graduate students or even postdocs or visiting scientists, I think you walk a very fine line, because if you're truly interested in the development of that individual as a person and as a scientist, you have to give them freedom. But at the same time, you've got to give them direction. So what you hope is that when they come into your laboratory, you give them a kernel of an idea. You give them an area to work on. And then you, for a while, guide them. And what you hope in the end is that by the time they leave your laboratory, they know more about that particular area, that particular problem than you do. And they're the driver behind that project. And when that happens, you know that you've succeeded as a teacher and as a mentor. And as I've often, many times people have said to me, well, what's involved in graduate education? Well, part of it is doing research that you can write up and put into a dissertation and ultimately publish in peer-reviewed journals. But part of it is a way of thinking. And you've got to, for example, be able to identify important problems to work on. I mean, there are always problems out there, but there's only a small percentage of them are really important and worth working on. So you've got to identify what are the important problems. Secondly, you've got to be an experimentalist, and you've got to be able to go in the lab and design experiments that will prove or disprove your hypothesis surrounding your problem. Thirdly, you've got to know how to run, as I often say, the control experiments, so you don't make a fool out of yourself, and you propose a hypothesis and generate data when in fact you just didn't run the right control experiment. And then you need, fourthly, to be able to articulate your experimental results. And this really gets down to can you communicate verbally? Can you organize your thoughts into a presentation? Can you write a paper? And then finally, you really need to know how to put your observations, your experimental observations, into the context of the broader discipline, the broader field that you're working in. And I always try to watch graduate students as they go through their 4 or 5 years, and hopefully at some point you recognize all 5 of these skills. Now, sometimes students exhibit those. Sometimes they never exhibit them. They tend to exhibit them when they're postdocs. So I guess the one thing I would say about training graduate students, and even postdocs and visiting scientists, everyone is different. And so it's like we have 3 wonderful children, my wife and I will tell you each one of those 3 children were different, and we had to treat them differently. The 170 people I've had in my lab over the years, I would say every one of them were different, and I've had to adapt the way I dealt with them, very much like I had to adapt to the children, in order to give them the proper guidance and the proper. So one size doesn't fit all. Just like one size doesn't fit all with your children, one size doesn't fit all with your graduate students. But what you find with some students, for example, and I found this frequently a number of years ago, was that students love to tinker. They love to do an experiment here and do an experiment there. But when it came down to putting it into a package that they could present in a paper or in a presentation, they got bored. And so I often make the analogy that those students really had difficulty in the sense that they were like a football player who knew how to get to the 5-yard line, but didn't know how to score a touchdown. And a lot of faculty will just ignore that, and they'll just say, okay, the student generated the data, I can write up the paper now. But as a teacher and as a mentor, I feel it's my job to teach them how to score a touchdown. And so I take it upon myself to really force them to take it over the goal line and to get the satisfaction of saying, whoa, I completed that, I got a paper out of that, I made a nice presentation out of that. That's all part of science, is to get that satisfaction of accomplishing and completing a project. not only participate in, but also try to encourage and foster. In fact, one of the reasons I was attracted back to KU as a faculty member in 1971 was I saw an environment here that was unique in the sense that while there were departments of medicinal chemistry and pharmaceutical chemistry and biochemistry, faculty members could collaborate, they could interact, they could apply for joint grants, research grants, training grants. And so you could be involved in a multidisciplinary research training type environment. And that environment was created in large part by Ed Smithman, by Takeru Higuchi. That tradition has continued over the years and is flourishing here and really makes us a unique institution in terms of biomedical research. You don't find this in most other universities. I mean, certainly you do find faculty members at other universities who are successful in the sense that they're individual entrepreneurs. They do their own thing, but I think by having an environment here where you have the opportunity to cross disciplines and have collaborative research programs and training programs, really what you're doing is you're creating a unique environment which is probably much more appropriate in terms of a training environment for students today than that isolated silo mentality that many academics develop. Because many of our students will end up in the pharmaceutical industry, for example, where teamwork is absolutely essential. Every day they're sitting around a table with people from all kinds of different disciplines, including non-scientific disciplines, medicine, I shouldn't say medicine, but other non-scientific disciplines, marketing, sales, medicine, and in those meetings, people have to have respect for one another. And they have to respect the individuals, they have to respect their knowledge in their particular field in order to have the team function effectively. And so we try to create an environment here in the department where collaborations, teamwork are an integral part of the graduate education process. This is a very interesting time in my professional life in the sense that I have worked in these two very different disciplines, the biochemistry, medicinal chemistry discipline and the pharmaceutical chemistry discipline. And it turns out that in pharmaceutical companies there has been a dramatic paradigm shift in how drugs are discovered and developed, which started in the 90s and is continuing today in every company worldwide. And what this requires is that people traditionally trained over here, say in biochemistry and medicinal chemistry, really need to have a basic knowledge and understanding of what people in pharmaceutical chemistry do, and vice versa. And so I found myself in the last 4 or 5 years being invited to give lectures off campus, invited to give actually short courses off campus as kind of continuing education, trying to provide these different disciplines with some very, very basic knowledge to allow them to function more effectively as team members. And to illustrate that, Professor Valstella, who's a colleague of mine here in the department, myself and 2 colleagues from the University of North Carolina, Professor Kim Brower and Darren Thacker, offer a short course, a 1-day short course in pharmaceutical companies to discovery scientists, teaching them the basics of pharmaceutical chemistry. And again, this is a service that I think universities should provide. And in fact, it's become so popular, we've done it almost in every major pharma company in the United States and many biotechnology companies in the United States and in Europe over the last few years. And again, this is a form of teaching that often lay people don't see, but I think is a very important part of my role as a professor. And I can tell you it brings great recognition to both the University of Kansas and to the University of North Carolina. So we not only have recognition for excellence in basketball at both institutions, but we have excellence, recognition for excellence in the pharmaceutical sciences. And so while we're the people there presenting the course, and it's our name that's affiliated with it, the University of Kansas and the University of North Carolina are recognized as schools that have excellent programs in this area. As I look back on my career, I feel extremely fortunate to have had the opportunity to pursue my passion in terms of research and teaching here at the University of Kansas. I could not have imagined a better place or a place that I could have been more productive than the University of Kansas. And I feel this way because the university has always been supportive of me and sometimes my crazy ideas they've allowed me to pursue. And as a result, I think I've flourished in this environment. And also the community, the Lawrence community has been wonderful in terms of raising our family here. Our children all went through the school systems. They all went to KU. And so I could not have imagined a better place to have spent the last 35 years of my life. Now, as I look forward, I guess I certainly want to continue to be active professionally, both as a teacher and as a researcher and as a mentor. But I think you do reach a point in your career where you've got to realize that you maybe can contribute in different ways than you contributed during the first 35 years of your life. And so I find myself now often being asked to give presentations that are still scientific, but maybe they're more oriented towards strategic thinking, or sometimes they're educational presentations, or I'm asked to consult with universities about revising their programs. So it's, again, strategic thinking. I'm an editor of a major scientific journal. I enjoy that a great deal. We've made some significant changes in that journal, and it's flourishing.